Hello boils and ghouls, and welcome back to part 2 of our special Halloween Build-A roster. This is the show where we take a hypothetical fighting game and build our dream roster around it. And on the last episode, we decided to make the ultimate horror crossover fighter. What would happen if somehow every movie studio on Earth was just suddenly cool with sharing their characters and we could build a fighting game out of some of the biggest horror movie characters of all time? However, speaking of that, before we begin, I've got a special announcement today. If you're watching this, then there's probably a good chance that you're a fan of horror movies and video games. And if you like horror movies, then you've probably heard about the documentary In Search of Darkness. This was a massive 3-part tribute to 80s horror films, and if you followed me on social media for a while, then you've probably heard me talk about it because I love this series. I've watched these films more times than I can remember, and it's actually one of my favorite things to put on when I have a long night of editing. Well, I bring this up today because the talented minds behind In Search of Darkness are embarking on a brand new venture, and they're taking their in-depth, passionate look at horror and applying it to horror video games with their brand new film, Terror Bites. From the dawn of survival horror to the boom of Resident Evil and Silent Hill, all the way up to the indie revolution going on today, this film is planning on uncovering all that and so much more. However, in order to make this the best documentary that they can, they need your help. This film is still very early in production, and as they bring everything together, they want to hear from you. They want to know what you want to see. So I'm including in the description of this video a link to where you can go to take a survey to tell them what you're interested in. What games do you want to see them cover? What topics do you want them to delve into? And so much more. And trust me when I tell you, I've been in contact with people working on this film. They do indeed read every single survey. Your say actually does matter to what this film could possibly be. Your input can make a difference. So here is your chance to have your say in horror gaming history. So before we continue the video today, I want you all to do me just a quick favor. Just pause the video, go to that description, find the link to the survey, and fill that out because it would help them a ton. Thanks in advance for checking them out, and now let's get back to building the DLC and more for the greatest horror movie fighting game of all time. So, as I said in that intro, this is the follow-up to part 1 of our Build-A roster on creating a fighting game made up of famous horror movie characters. If you didn't see that episode, then a card for it is popping up right now, but even if you did see it, you might still need a little refresher. Okay, so here are the rules for this roster. Everyone has to be from horror movies. No games, no comics, no creepypastas, no urban legends, no SCPs. None of that. Maybe we'll give each of them their own roster in future Halloweens, but in order to get a more interesting roster with more unique choices, we are only sticking to one medium for this game. Second rule, none of the classic movie monsters because they're all in the public domain, so it's not special to include them, and also because there's thousands of versions of each of them rather than being one specific character. And third, the character would have to work in a fighting game. Meaning, they have to have a tone that fits this game, but more importantly, they have to do enough in their movies that I could see giving them a complete moveset including normal attacks, specials, and multiple supers. Also, last time we discussed how this game would play. We said that it would be similar to Mortal Kombat in that characters would have fatalities and brutalities, but to try and capture the tone of a horror film, we introduced 2 mechanics. For starters, you would have a super meter that could go up to 3 bars, but to try and capture the feeling of a horror film, when the monster comes back for one final attack when you think they're dead, if you were KO'd in the final round and you had at least 1 stock of super meter, you could spend all your meter to come back for a brief moment with severely reduced health. And the second mechanic, and the most important one for discussing this roster, each character would have some kind of a power-up that would be completely unique to them. Horror films always ramp up the tension as the movie goes along, with the villain becoming a bigger threat as the film progresses, and always pulling out all the stops at the very end. So each character would have some kind of unique ability that can power them up as the match goes on. For some characters, that means increasing their stats, unlocking new moves or abilities. Heck, with one of the characters, we gave them an insta-kill that you have to slowly build up over time. So there's a lot of creativity that you can put into this idea. And now that we got all that established, let's just remind everyone who our starting 19 characters were. Ash Williams, Candyman, Chucky with Tiffany as an alternate skin, David from The Lost Boys, Elvira, Freddy Krueger, Ghostface, Jason Voorhees, Jigsaw, or more accurately, Amanda Young with Jigsaw as support, Laurie Strode, Leatherface, Michael Myers, Pennywise, Pinhead, Pumpkinhead, Red the Tethered, Sadako, Stripe the Gremlin, and the Tall Man. If you want more details on them and how they would play and why we chose them, then again, check the card that's popping up right now to watch part 1. But I think now it's time that we finally hop in that DLC. Now, normally we would only do one season of DLC, but that would make this a very short episode. And you know what? It's a special time of the year. It's my favorite holiday, that time when ghosts and goblins roam free and we celebrate everything that goes bump in the night. So today, we're going to do 3 seasons of DLC with 6 characters each. Mean for this special horror builder roster, our DLC is going to be 666. I had to do it, you knew it was coming. So let's go ahead and get into Season 1. Wow, it feels weird jumping into the roster this early in a video. Is there something that I can just vamp with and take up more time talking about absolutely nothing? No? No, we're just going to get into the roster? Alright, here we go. I've often said that Season 1 of a fighting game DLC should always feel like the characters who were missing from the main roster, but you know what? I think we did a pretty good job including all the big faces in the base rosters, so we can go ahead and just start getting weird right off the bat. And you don't get much weirder than Dr. Herbert West from Reanimator. I love Reanimator, but I did feel it was a bit too out there for the base roster. Plus, Herbert West isn't much of a fighter, but there's certainly enough personality there and crazy mad science backing him up that we could get creative and come up with a complete moveset for him. He uses this glow-in-the-dark ecto cooler to resurrect the dead, so let's say that he summons out zombies to attack the opponent. But he can also mix up special potions to strengthen himself up, speed himself up, give himself armor. If you can't tell, this would be the main point of his character, giving himself and his zombie soldiers various buffs through his potions. Making him a character that requires a lot of setup, but it could pay off in big ways. And since West is constantly tinkering with his formula, let's say that the more potions you mix up and the more you use them throughout the match, the stronger potions you then have access to as the match goes on. Next, I teased him earlier, so let's go ahead and include him in the DLC. It's the Leprechaun. He's had one of the longest running horror franchises ever, complete with a reboot, a requel, and an installment in space. He's marked off almost every box on the horror icon checklist. If he ever has a kid in one of these films, I think we've got a bingo. So yeah, let's go ahead and include him. He uses magic, so we could give him a wide variety of specials with various effects, but let's say that his more powerful spells are all locked off when the match begins. But as you attack the opponent, they'll drop gold coins. You can then run across the stage and pick the coins up, and the more coins you collect, the stronger spells you have access to. Now, as I mentioned, you want to include the new hotness in your roster, but with so many famous classic horror movie characters, I didn't have a lot of space for the newer ones in the base roster, so let's fill out the DLC with a couple of new faces, and what a face this one is! Art the Clown from the Terrifier series. Art might be the biggest horror icon to originate within the last decade. When you ask big horror fans who is a modern day classic, there's a good chance they're going to say Art. Problem is, as I have already made it clear, Art is a crazy clown, and we don't need more than one crazy clown in the starting roster, and I'm sorry Art, but you're not beating Pennywise. But now that we're on the DLC, you can send in the clowns, so let's include Art. As for how he'd fight... oh jeez. Okay. For anyone who doesn't know about the Terrifier series, the number one thing it's known for is being brutal. It is a franchise that is for the gore hounds. I'm risking an age restriction on this video just showing Art on screen. Hell, I'm probably not even going to show that much of him. I'm going to repeat a lot of footage in here because there isn't a whole lot of footage of Art where he isn't viciously attacking someone in the most disturbing way. So here's my idea of how he'd fight. When Art starts torturing someone, he just keeps going. He goes to that point where you think this can't get worse, and then it gets worse. So let's give Art a handful of special moves. But after he lands one of these special moves, he'll have 3 different follow-up commands that he can enter. And if you do one of them correctly, you will add an additional attack onto that special move. But here's where the power-up comes into play. If you land one of these 3 follow-ups enough time, then it'll upgrade that follow-up, and now you'll be able to link that follow-up into one of the 2 other follow-ups. I feel like I need a flowchart to explain this, but basically, let's say that you do special move A. Then after doing special move A, you can then link that into follow-up A, B, or C. If you keep doing one of those follow-ups enough times throughout the match, eventually it'll upgrade, and now you'll be able to link that into another follow-up. So if you keep doing this throughout the entire match, eventually you'll be able to do special move A, then link that into follow-up A, then link that into follow-up B, then link that into follow-up C. Basically, you want Art to be a character that makes the opponent say, "Damn, dude, are you done?" Next up, I know that we've cleared out most of the big horror mascots of the 80s and 90s, but there's still a few of them left. Granted, most of them are really bad, but there's still some of them that I think have some legs. Like Wishmaster, which despite how bad those films got, I still think the first one is a solid horror film with an incredibly memorable villain. And I've got a very unique idea for his playstyle. The Wishmaster is a djinn who has to grant wishes for people, growing stronger with each wish that he grants until he's able to break free and bring hell on Earth. So let's give him a handful of unique special moves called wishes. Let's say about 5 in total. And yes, I know that 3 is the standard number for wishes, but that's far too little for our purposes today. And each of these wishes don't hurt your opponent. They actually help them. It can give them a bar of meter, it can give them health, it can give them armor for a limited amount of time, or several other buffs. So why would you want to give your opponent buffs? Because each time that you land one of these 5 wishes, Wishmaster's attack and speed would increase by 5%. Not for a limited time, for the remainder of the whole match, and they would stack. And once you land one of these wishes, that move would then be replaced with a brand new attack that would do major damage to the opponent. And again, this new attack would remain for the entire match. So while a character that buffs your opponent might not sound like a good idea, if you played your cards right, at the start of round 2, you would have no more buffs to give out, and instead, you would be 25% faster and stronger, and you would have 5 new special moves with huge power behind them. And our final 2 characters for Season 1 are actually a pair. I said that we fit almost all of the big horror icons into our base roster, but there's one major star that I did leave out. The Xenomorph. Yeah, the original Alien film is one of the best horror films of the 70s. Hell, one of the best horror films of all time. But I left the Xenomorph off the base roster because after that first film, the vast majority of its movies have been action films with almost no horror to be found. But screw it, we're on the DLC right now, so we can stretch the rules a little bit. And I'd say that first film is so important to the horror genre that it absolutely can get the Xenomorph into the DLC. As for how they'd fight, I kind of like a lot of the special moves he has in MKX, but I'm not the biggest fan of the fact that he, well, doesn't stand like a Xenomorph. Yeah, he fights more upright like an actual fighting game character, so instead, let's get weird with it and have him mostly hunched over throughout the match or even walking around on all 4s, which might give him a weird hitbox, is what I would say if we didn't already have Chucky in here. Yeah, all hitboxes are on the table now, folks. Nothing is a weird hitbox in this game. And as for their power-up mechanic, well, I'd like to remind everyone, I've been saying power-up simply because there isn't a better word for it. But really, it's just a mechanic where the character becomes a bigger threat as the match goes on. So for Xenomorph, let's give them a move where they can summon out eggs onto the field. The eggs can be destroyed if they take enough hits, and also the eggs would be on some kind of a cooldown meter, so that way the alien can't just keep spamming them and putting them on the field over and over and over again. But if the egg isn't destroyed in time, then it'll hatch, and a facehugger will come out and start scurrying across the field towards the opponent. The facehugger can also be destroyed if they get hit with a low attack, but if they make it all the way to the opponent, then they would jump on their face, stunning them, leaving them wide open for an attack. But that's not the big threat. If you let this happen, if that facehugger gets on your head, then you are now on a timer. You've all seen the movie, you all know where this is going. You now have a baby alien in your chest, and if you don't beat the xenomorph in time, it'll burst right out of you. It won't instantly KO you because, well, look at the rest of this roster. I actually don't think something bursting out from inside your body would be enough to kill most of the characters in this game, but it would do some major damage. But I mentioned that the xenomorph would be part of a pair. And that's because in each season of DLC, I want to include one horror hero. So our final character for Season 1 is Ellen Ripley. Although, even though it was the first film that was a horror classic, I'm basing Ripley off her portrayal in Aliens, the sequel. In the first film, she's a great character, but she doesn't really have a lot of moves that we could pull from. I mean, we could make her fatality hurt kicking you out of the airlock, but that's about all we got. But as for the sequel, she kicks all kinds of ass in that film. She carries around weapons that can make for great special attacks, and we all know what her big level 3 super would be.
Get away from her, you bitch!
Yep, let her smack you around in the power loader. This one writes itself. And as for her fatality, let her board a ship and blast off, only for her to then nuke the site from orbit because it's the only way to be sure. So we've got some new characters mixed with some classics, a handful of big names, and a few more obvious choices. But now that that's out of the way, we can hop into Season 2. Is what I would say, except as I mentioned last time, I want to go beyond just the DLC in this roster. Yeah, we're daydreaming today about making the ultimate horror movie fighting game, and there are so many other places where you can shove in horror references to make this feel like the ultimate monster mash. And the best place to do that is in the stages. I mentioned that since this would be a spooky and brutal fighting game, it would borrow some aspects from Mortal Kombat, such as the fatalities. Well, Mortal Kombat hasn't just had character fatalities, it's also had stage fatalities. Finishing moves unique to special stages. And if there's one thing as important to a horror film as the monsters, it's the locations. A haunted house, a ghost town, a cabin in the woods, these can add the necessary ambiance to give your movie that shot of thrills and chills that it needs. There are so many locations that are iconic to the history of horror, and we could give them some great stage fatalities, while at the same time squeezing in a couple of other horror icons who wouldn't work as fighters. Let's start with stages based around characters that are already in this game. For Ash, he would have to have the Nobi Cabin. This is the quintessential horror movie cabin in the woods, and it's where Ash keeps returning again and again. For the stage fatality, let's have you fighting inside the cabin with all the laughing furniture in the background, Ash's severed hand crawling around on the floor, and most importantly, the cellar door on one side of the screen. Every now and again, you would see someone trying to break free from the cellar. And for the stage fatality, if you beat the opponent on that side of the screen with the cellar door, then a pair of hands would reach out from under it and drag the opponent under the boards, and you would just see a spray of red stuff flying out that I probably can't show here for fear of getting demonetized. Seriously, I don't even know where to begin blurring this scene. Next up, a few obvious ones. Jigsaw. Simple, put in one of his labs or mazes or whatever you want to call them, and if you lose, then your opponent gets knocked into one of his jigsaw traps. Fairly simple. And Leatherface's stage would absolutely be set on the Sawyer farm, and you see other members of Leatherface's family running around inside the house, with Grandpa sitting right there on the front porch. And if you get KO'd in front of Grandpa, then you would get knocked right to his feet, and then the other Sawyers would come out and help Grandpa to finish you off with a hammer. He was the best killer who ever lived after all. Next up, this one isn't a stage fatality, but it is something that I have to include. We got Red from Us in here, and we got David from the Lost Boys. Guess what? Us and Lost Boys take place in the exact same location. Yeah, they both had scenes built around the Santa Monica boardwalk. They even referenced the Lost Boys at the very beginning of Us.
You know, they're filming something by the carousel. You should see if they're looking for extras.
So let's say the stage for David is up on the boardwalk, and the stage for Red is in the underground tunnels beneath it. And if you finish a round on either of those stages by knocking the opponent against the wall, then you get a cinematic of them being sent either up or down, and then the next round begins on the other stage. Then for the Gremlins, we gotta go with Clamp Tower from Gremlins 2. I know that Gremlins 2 wasn't a horror film, it was a slapsticky comedy, but that setting is just too good to not use as the stage. You could have all the other gremlins partying in the background, get all the weird, super-powered gremlins back there, have them play into the stage fatality in some way. Heck, go all in on the Easter eggs and replace the announcer on this stage with the brain gremlin.
Well, it's rather brutal here. We're advising our clients to put everything they've got into canned food and shotguns.
But as for the more unique stages, the ones that aren't centered around characters who are already in this roster, let's have a stage set on a long pier at the beach. You knock the enemy off the stage into the water, and suddenly the Jaws theme starts playing, and then you get swallowed up by Bruce the Shark. Next up, the Cube. From Cube. Make this the training stage. I mean, everyone hates training stages because they're just big white grids, but the rooms in the Cube are just big white grids. So you could at least claim that your boring training stage was really a clever reference. And you could give this stage a fatality where if you knock the opponent into the next cube over, then they get hit with a variety of traps. Nothing really complicated, but it will allow us to put multiple different finishers into this one room. Maybe you get cut up, set on fire, blown up. These little cubes can fit so many traps in them that even Jigsaw would be jealous. After that, we gotta pay homage to George Romero. He's one of the biggest horror directors of all time thanks to Night of the Living Dead and all of its sequels. I don't need to explain to you why George Romero's Dead films are so important. They shape what zombies are today. But unfortunately, none of the characters in his films would really be a good fit for a fighting game. But we can still give them a stage. So let's go with the Monroeville Mall from Dawn of the Dead. As memorable as the cabin from Night of the Living Dead was, or the bunker from Day of the Dead, the mall from Dawn of the Dead was the entire premise of that film. So yeah, let's set the stage in the mall with tons of zombies in the background, and maybe when you win, some bikers would start riding through the background hating zombies with pies. If you've never seen Dawn of the Dead, that last sentence probably confused you. And you know what? We can have the Dawn of the Dead stage do double duty and just take all the zombies out and then replace them with robots, and now it's the mall from Chopping Mall. Just have the robots riding around in the background, you see them chasing some of the store employees from the film, or heck, maybe just have a Dick Miller substitute as the janitor sweeping up on that stage, and he gets disappointed with you anytime that you make a mess with all your fighting. Then let's get weird. Let's throw in there the house. From House. This is one of the craziest haunted houses in any film ever. I won't even try to sum it all up, but I will say that the stage fatality has to be you getting eaten by the monster piano. Next up, speaking of haunted houses, the Amityville house. You all knew we had to do it. It's one of the most famous haunted houses in horror movie history. Either go classic with the stage and base it around the first movie, or just get nuts with it and set it in space because yes, there have been so many Amityville films that they eventually went to space. If you ever want a good laugh, just go on Tubi and type in Amityville just to see how many low-budget horror films snagged up this series just to make a buck off it. Then you gotta have the Bates Motel in there. I didn't think Norman Bates had enough moves to pull from in order to warrant a spot on this roster, but the Bates Motel is too iconic to not be included. And you could still give Norman a cameo in the stage fatality. Let's say if you punch the opponent into the wall as you finish them off, then they go flying through it into the shower, and then all of a sudden Mrs. Bates pops up and starts stabbing away at them. Then let's pay respect to J-horror again and include the house from Ju-On. I know some people suggested that we should include Kayako from Ju-On, or as some people know it, The Grudge, but since Kayako is tied to her house, I figured we could just make the house a stage and then Kayako comes out for the fatality. Then this one is a personal favorite of mine, the facility from Cabin in the Woods. I won't go into too many details on this one simply because I know not everyone watching this is a big horror fan and they might not have watched Cabin in the Woods, but if you haven't seen it, go see it. It's one of my favorite horror films of all time, and even if you're not a big horror fan, you'll still probably end up enjoying it. It's still got a lot to offer. But as I said, I'm not going into too many details because if you don't know what Cabin in the Woods is, good. That's the best way to watch that movie. Go in knowing absolutely nothing. The less you know, the better. But if you have seen it, you probably can guess what the stage is going to be. And the final stage that we have to include, the Overlook Hotel from The Shining. I said that the Amityville house was the most famous haunted house in horror history, but that's only because the Overlook is a hotel and not a house. There are few horror locations more iconic than the Overlook, and we could load it with tons of great background visuals. Fight past a hallway and then you see the twins standing down there at the very end. You walk past an elevator in the background and you see that the doors are starting to shake open and little bits of blood are starting to spill out. And I don't have a fatality in mind for this stage, but I do have a special ending screen. Let's say if you win on the Overlook stage, then rather than getting your normal outro, it then cuts to a black and white photo of the big New Year's party, and trapped inside the photo is the defeated opponent. Stages with special win screens is something that you don't hardly see at all in fighting games, but it's a cool idea and I would like to see way more people experiment with it. But there's no end to horror stages that you could include. Heck, I didn't even get into any of the old black and white Vincent Price films. All of those had creepy haunted houses in them. But we have to keep this episode rolling, and that means it's time for Season 2. Now, typically, Season 2 of DLC is when you can get experimental and weird with this roster. Which raises the question, in a game like this, how weird can you get? First up, let's throw in another classic, Carrie White. This one was a really hard choice to put on here because tonally, it's a pretty serious film, and as you'll see from our next few choices, I am once again trying to stick with the more fun side of horror characters. But we have had some serious characters on here already, so I'd say it's safe to include her. And she's definitely one of the most famous horror characters of the 70s, while receiving multiple attempts to update her film. All of which failed, but that still speaks to the character's legacy. She's telekinetic, so of course she would be a zoner, flinging various props at the opponent. But to spice her up, we could give her a rage meter. And yes, I realize that's already a thing in Samurai Showdown, but it's the best name that I could come up with. Basically, the more that she gets hurt, the higher the rage meter goes up. And once it hits the breaking point, she would become drenched in blood, recapturing the famous prom scene moment from her film. And now the objects she throws out for her specials would be even larger and she'd throw them faster, or it would give her access to brand new special moves. But I said we were going to get weird this season, and Carrie's kind of a safe choice. So I say we use Carrie to sneak in another character. Just like how we used an alternate skin on Chucky in order to sneak Tiffany in here, we could give Carrie a Tina Shepard skin. Yes, for anybody who doesn't know, in Friday the 13th Part 7, he fought a telekinetic girl, and the premise of the film was basically what if Jason fought Carrie. Don't get me wrong, Tina isn't nearly the most popular character in the Friday the 13th franchise, but it would be good to sneak in at least one of the protagonists from that franchise, and she does have the exact same power set as Carrie. It just makes way too much sense. Now, I did mention that each season of DLC was going to include one horror hero in here, but don't worry, Tina does not count for our horror hero. She is just an alternate skin, just a little Easter egg to fit another character in here. No, we are going to make sure that the horror hero still gets their own slot in this roster, but for Season 2, our hero is going to be one of the unlikely persuasion. Shaun from Shaun of the Dead. This is one of the best horror comedies of all time, with so many memorable characters and lines. I would love to include Shaun, and best of all, he would fight completely different from any of the other horror heroes. As I said earlier, the big problem with most horror heroes is they don't have a wide variety of moves to pull from in order to make them fighting game characters. But the other big problem with most horror heroes is that the ones who do tend to fight back, they tend to mostly just use guns. And there's just not a lot that you can do with that. Once you have one gun-toting character in your roster, how do you make the next gun-toting character feel different from them? But Shaun doesn't have that issue. In fact, Edgar Wright even said that one of the ideas behind Shaun of the Dead was how do you make a zombie film in a country that doesn't have guns? So yeah, Shaun would be completely different. He'd swing around a cricket bat for his basic attacks, but for his specials, he could have his buddy Ed come out and tackle them, or have a zombie come out and start attacking whatever gets in its way. I know we suggested doing something like that for Herbert West, but well, watch Reanimator and then watch Shaun of the Dead. They're very different types of zombies, so I think it's fine. But for his more unique abilities, he could dig through a box of old records and pull out random albums. He could then throw the albums at the opponent, and depending on which album he pulls out, it would have different properties, like dealing damage, stunning the opponent, boomeranging to hit the opponent twice, and various other effects. This means Sean would require a little bit of luck to use him, but we all saw that movie. We know Sean survived 90% because of dumb luck. And as for his power-up, or buff, or whatever you want to call it, give him a super where he hits the opponent. Then it goes into a cinematic of him thinking up a plan of how to win, acting out the attack and damaging the opponent. However, if you do that attack a second time, he repeats the action, but then after he goes through it once, he says, no, that won't work. Then he does a new plan, hitting the opponent again to do more damage. Then, if you land it a third time, he goes through both of the first two stages of the plan. Then he comes up with a third plan, each one being acted out and each one doing damage to the opponent, and it finally ends with Sean saying that after the fight is over, they'll all go down to the Winchester and wait for all this to blow over. Imagine finishing the opponent off with that attack, and this is the big KO screen.
A nice cold pint and wait for all this to blow over.
Now, with everything that I just laid out there, you might expect Sean to be a joke character, one here mostly for laughs. But if we're talking about characters here for laughs, look no further than... Yep, if you check your watches, you'll notice it's time for more clowns. I announced long ago that we would be doing this builder roster on horror movie icons, and I got so many people asking, will killer clowns from outer space be on there? I kid you not, multiple people called out the killer clowns by name. I had no idea there was so much love for this franchise. And I am very happy to see that because I love the killer clowns from outer space. This movie is fantastic. It is an incredible send-up of cheesy 50s horror films while being something completely original and very creative all on its own. So yeah, you guys didn't have to worry. The killer clowns from outer space were always going to be in this roster. And heck, they're even about to make a comeback thanks to that new multiplayer game they have coming out. By the way, quick side tangent, horror movies, stop giving us multiplayer games. We are good on multiplayer games based on horror movies. There are so many of them at the moment. Give us another single player game. We are starving for them. Now let's get back to talking about this hypothetical multiplayer game based on horror movies. So yes, Killer Clowns from Outer Space. I love that movie, and between all the different skins that we could give the clowns, the massive creative list of moves that we could give them, they were a must for this roster. But they were no match for Pennywise, so off to DLC they went. And as for how they play, hell, just watch the movie. It's wall-to-wall props and special powers that we could easily turn to moves. Attacking with shadow puppets, balloon animals, knocking the enemy's block off. They would easily have the most moves of any character in this game. They would be the Dante of this series. That's a comparison I bet nobody was expecting to get made today. Next, I told y'all that we were going to get weird this season. So let's get weird. Because this game is about to be rated PG for Psycho Goreman. Yeah, in case anyone out there has been disappointed because they didn't think my obscure picks were obscure enough and they didn't think my weird picks were weird enough, might I present to you Psycho Goreman. He's from the horror sci-fi comedy of the same name released in 2020, and I'll admit I got some problems with this film, but I got no problems with PG himself. He is quite possibly my favorite horror character of the last decade. Essentially, this movie is a morbid, R-rated Power Rangers from the villain's point of view with a dash of the grim adventures of Billy and Mandy. Psycho Goreman is nearly all-powerful, but he's held back by a little girl named Mimi who has the source of his power under her control. So let's make him incredibly powerful, but you'd have to unlock new levels of his power as you fight. I'm picturing something along the lines of Frank West in Marvel vs. Capcom, where he would have to do a long combo, and then after he does that combo, you could then activate a move where Mimi decides if the combo was cool enough. If the combo was long enough, she would give you a thumbs up, and now you would be even stronger. And as for his fatality, listen, if you've seen the movie, you already know what it is. He gives your opponent a warrior's death. That's all I'm going to say about it. Now, as I've made clear throughout this video, there's several different subgenres within horror, and one that doesn't get nearly enough respect is the horror anthology. I love a good horror anthology, but since they're just a bunch of shorts, they rarely contain characters with enough screen time to become iconic. But if there's one character that breaks that rule, it's Sam from Trick or Treat. This is one of, if not the most popular horror anthology of the last 20 years, and thanks to Sam's memorable design and the quirkiness behind him, he instantly became a fan favorite. He's a ghostly trick-or-treater, so let's have him fight with various candies that he can pull out of his sack. Razor-sharp suckers that he can slash at the opponent, candy corn that he can leave scattered on the ground and act as a trap, candy bars that he can stab the opponent with, and as for his unique mechanics, how about Sam only has a limited amount of candy, and each time that he uses a special, his candy meter goes down. Once it's depleted, he can't use his special moves anymore, but he now throws the world's biggest temper tantrum and he pulls off his mask and now his moves are much quicker, making him a very hard character to catch with tons of brand new combo potential. But if you would rather use his specials than speed boost, we could give him a super where he refills his candy bag, calming him back down again and refilling all of his special moves. This would make him different from a lot of the other characters, because a lot of the other characters, as I said, as the game goes on, they would get some kind of a brand new ability, some kind of new buff. Sam would be a character who would be good at both the beginning of the match and at the end of the match, but for completely different reasons, so you would have to decide how you wanted to play as him. What would be your goal with this character? And for the final character this season, I want to make something of a reach. Sure, we got some weird picks in here, but there's still characters that you could see working in a fighting game. I want to get one character in here that wouldn't be at the top of anyone's list of obvious choices, but is still a fan favorite and would get people excited to see how they would play. Patrick Bateman from American Psycho. This film was a cult classic for decades, but it feels like over the past couple of years, everybody just suddenly discovered it. Like, I have no idea how it happened, but I have seen more people talking about American Psycho in the past 2 years than I saw in the 20 years before that. But hey, if that is the way the winds are blowing, then let it not be said that I don't also blow. Now, Patrick doesn't seem like he's got a huge range of moves, but when you watch the film, you'll notice that he does indeed use a wide variety of weapons. And he even does some physical attacks that we could easily turn to basic moves. But most importantly, and why I think he would work, Patrick Bateman has personality, and we can translate that into his moves. Imagine a counter move where he presents the opponent with a business card, and the enemy is then just stunned as they stop and stare at the card, allowing Bateman to counterattack them. And Bateman loves to monologue.
There is an idea of a Patrick Bateman. Some kind of abstraction, but there is no real me. I'm trying to listen to the new Robert Palmer tape, but Evelyn, my supposed fiancée, keeps buzzing in my ear. Marcus and I even go to the same barber, although I have a slightly better haircut. My nightly bloodlust has overflowed into my days. I feel lethal, on the verge of frenzy.
Do you like Phil Collins? I've been a big Genesis fan ever since the release of their 1980 album, Duke.
A lot. So let's give Bateman a unique property where if you successfully hit the opponent with his special moves, he starts monologuing. For example, we could give him a Rekka attack, and anytime that you successfully chain the hits of the Rekka together, he would start monologuing as he's doing the attack. Now, why is this important? Because Bateman would also have, for lack of a better term, an ego meter. Whenever he monologues, that meter would slowly increase. And if you can max it out in a round, he goes full unhinged, his hair becomes a mess, and he starts screaming as he gets a speed boost for the rest of the round, and now those Rekka attacks that I mentioned earlier connect themselves with a single input. And heck, I mentioned that we were putting him in here mostly for his personality. Do you know how much personality we could give this monologuing mechanic? Imagine if he had a unique monologue against every single opponent, like the dark version of those Snake Codex entries in Smash Bros. And for his fatality, you all know what it's going to be. It's the thing that jumped into your head the second I said his name and is 2/3 the reason that he's in this roster at all.
Hey, Paul!
We would have to license some Huey Lewis in the news in order to make it work, but you know what, it'd be worth it. And that brings us to the end of Season 2. Only one season left before we bring this episode to a close. But I'm not done just yet. I mentioned there are so many other places that we could fit characters and Easter eggs in here, and I got one more big idea to just fill every nook and cranny in this game with spooky goodness. So you remember in Mortal Kombat X they introduced factions? Basically you'd join a team, then as you play you would build up XP for that team. I'll admit, I love Mortal Kombat X, but I never really got that too into the whole faction stuff, so I didn't really pay much attention to every single thing that did. But there was one part of the factions that I really dug. The faction fatalities, where each faction would have a special character associated with that faction that you could then bring in to do a fatality. Well, I've mentioned multiple times over these 2 episodes that there are just so many characters who wouldn't work in a fighting game, mostly because they just didn't have a full moveset behind them. But we could certainly get one good fatality out of them. So let's have 4 factions in this game, with each faction getting 5 different characters who could pop up for a fatality. First faction, Team Creature Feature. These are just your good old-fashioned monsters. If it isn't quite human, then it goes here. Their faction kills will include Belial from Basket Case, Audrey 2 from Little Shop of Horrors, the Blob from, well, the Blob, specifically the 1980s remake, the Critters who would form into a giant critter ball, leaving the opponent as a cartoonish skeleton, and lastly, the Tar Man from Return of the Living Dead. I had to include someone from Return of the Living Dead. It's one of the best zombie films of all time, one of the best horror comedies of all time, one of the best punk films of all time, so I had to get someone in here. And it was either going to be Tarman or Trash. But I don't think I have a censor bar big enough for Trash, so yeah, let's go Tarman. Next faction, Evil Spirits. These are your ghosts, demons, basically if it's tied to the afterlife or hell or curses, then it counts. These faction kills will include the Babadook, the Pirates from John Carpenter's The Fog, Black Phillip from The Witch, had to fit the literal goat Black Phillip in here, the Nun from the Conjuring films, because even though I will admit the Nun films aren't great, The Conjuring has been probably the biggest horror franchise of the past 10 years, so feels like we should get someone from those films in here. And the last faction kill for Team Evil Spirits.
Look at me, Damien. It's all for you.
Damien from The Omen. Listen, I already made the 666 joke earlier. There was no way he wasn't going to be in here. Have him come out and just stare at you as either a bunch of dogs start attacking you, or a giant metal flagpole comes down and hits you, or a sheet of glass comes in and takes you out. This could be the grab bag fatality. You never know what you're gonna get each time. Now going from the paranormal to something a little bit more human, Team Psychopaths. These aren't supernatural monsters or creatures from beyond the grave. No, they're just people. Crazy, murderous people. These faction kills will include The Strangers, Asami Yamazaki from Audition, Hannibal Lecter, who would have a special ending screen where he and your character sit down for a nice meal of questionable origin, Pearl from X and, well, Pearl, 2 of the best horror films of the past decade. Seriously, huge recommendation from me. You gotta check those out. Maybe not in front of your parents though, just warn you. And lastly, Billy Chapman, the Santa-themed killer from Silent Night, Deadly Night. Although, if you summon him out on a specific day of the week, then Billy wouldn't come out. Instead, he would be replaced by his brother, Ricky. You know, this guy.
Garbage Day! Huh? No!
Yeah, that isn't just a meme, it's from an actual film. That's Billy's brother Ricky, the villain of Silent Night, Deadly Night 2. Squeeze that in here as a secret Easter egg that only pops up every now and again, and people will go nuts for it. So that's 3 factions all dedicated to horror villains. So our final faction is Horror Heroes. These faction kills would include Tommy Jarvis, the biggest recurring hero of the Friday the 13th series, the Toxic Avenger, admittedly not a horror film, but a tribute and parody to weird 50s and 60s horror films, so I say it counts. Bert Gummert from Tremors, have a graboid come out and eat the opponent, only for Bert to step in and open fire on it, blowing up the graboid and the enemy at the same time. Then Tucker and Dale. These 2 come from one of my favorite horror comedies of all time, Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, a movie about a bunch of college kids who go up to the woods and they think a group of mountain folks are crazed killers, so they try to take them out first, only to keep accidentally killing themselves. So let's have Tucker and Dale come out and try and break up the fight and then tell everyone to just relax and chill out, we can just talk things out, and then they accidentally bump into your opponent and knock them into a wood chipper. And finally, the last horror hero, the Ghostbusters. Again, I know some people are going to argue this doesn't count, but I've always considered Ghostbusters to be a horror comedy, so I have to throw them in here. However, you would only be able to summon them out against ghost or spirit-themed characters like Freddy Krueger, Sadako, Candyman, or Pinhead, and they would blast them and then suck them into the ghost trap. You tell somebody there is a game out there where the Ghostbusters can suck up and capture Freddy Krueger, that game just sold an extra 1 million copies on that alone. But there you go, those are your 4 factions. I honestly think this is a great way to fit in characters who wouldn't fit into the full roster, and you could easily keep adding new characters with every season of DLC, or keep inventing new factions as the game goes on. You could make an aliens faction, a mad scientist faction. There's a lot of depth that you could give this idea. And there's so many other places where you could squeeze cameos and Easter eggs into this game. Heck, I would argue that the Crypt Keeper would be absolutely perfect as either the announcer or the guy who greets you on the menu screen. But I can't just keep listing off characters all day. It is time to wrap up this episode, which means it's time to move into Season 3. What big names are we still missing? How many more weird picks can I include? Are there any other clowns that I could throw in here? Yes, there are, but I'm not going to. I think we have enough clowns for now. My apologies go out to Captain Spaulding.
What's the matter, kid? Don't you like clowns? Why? Don't we make you laugh?
This is our final season, so let's kick it off with something big. The Predator. I was torn on including this one because while he is an amazing monster, one of the best monsters in movie history, a lot of people don't consider the first Predator film to be a horror movie, but I do. I think the original Predator is one of the most creative slasher films of the 80s, and even if it wasn't a horror film, the Predator is a monster designed specifically to scare the pants off you, so I say he fits right beside the rest of this cast. And we got the Xenomorph in the first season of DLC, so putting Predator in the final season would kind of be a nice balance. Plus, just like the Xenomorph, Predator has already been in a fighting game, and they actually did a pretty good job translating his abilities into his moveset. We can easily take inspiration from MKX for this one. And for his unique power-up, oh, I got a special idea on this one. Let's say that he gets a buff that would increase the power of all of his normal physical attacks, but it only activates when both he and the opponent enter the bottom third of their health. In other words, it would be meant to resemble the final confrontation in Predator, when Dutch is on his last leg and the Predator is done hunting him down and it's just time for the two of them to go head to head with each other. In fact, if you want to give this buff some extra flavor, let's say the Predator is wearing his mask throughout the entire match, but the moment that both players' life totals hit that exact amount, he would rip the mask off and do that famous roar of his, just to let you know this is the final showdown. It's time for both players to really go all out and throw out everything they have. And we could even give him a new ability based around the resurrection mechanic that I mentioned earlier. Let's say if you revive yourself in the final round and you use up 3 bars of super meter to do it, then you could have the Predator activate a self-destruct sequence to try and take the opponent out with him. Because if there is one thing the Predator is known for, it's being a really sore loser. Now for our next character, okay, I'm going to be 100% honest with all of you. This script was written and recorded before part 1 went up, and I had no plans of going back and changing anything. But then one fan contacted me and made a very, very strong argument for why one character should be included on this list. And I was familiar with this character, I knew they were a thing, but I never dove that deep into their history. But after reading up on them, well, I hope this fan is happy because this is not something that normally ever happens. Don't think this is going to be a regular thing, but yeah, they kind of won me over. So here goes. Originally, this spot on the roster was going to go to Matt Cordell, the Maniac Cop. But he has now been cast aside, and in his place, we're going to include the #1 horror hero of 1970s Mexico, El Santo. El Santo was one of the most famous luchadors in Mexico's history, becoming sort of a folk hero. And I know some people are saying right now, hey, you said these had to be characters from movies. Yes, I did. Here's the thing. El Santo went on to star in dozens of films. Dozens of them. And almost all of them were about him fighting monsters. And I don't mean just like made up monsters created just for that film. No, I mean named monsters. Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, the Wolfman, La Llorona. He fought all of them. So you know what? If this guy has a resume of fighting big name monsters that long, yeah, I say he counts. Also just going to throw this out there, but even after the original El Santo's death, there have continued to be El Santo films with his son taking up the role, and there have also been other El Santo projects like cartoons. So yeah, I kind of feel like they're within that same gray area as Elvira, where even though they were an actual person, they have now gone on to become a symbol. They've become an icon. They are a character who lives on beyond just the person that created. So I feel they count. Plus, I do want to include more international characters, and most importantly, speaking as a fan of grapplers, yeah, we only have one dedicated grappler on this roster so far. We have multiple rushdown characters, multiple zoners. We only have one grappler. That ain't right. So yeah, let's throw El Santo in here and let him powerbomb the ring girl. You know you want to see that. Now, previously, I had said that we were going to try and have at least one horror hero per season, but since this is the final season, let's sprinkle a few more in here. Our next hero is Tallahassee from Zombieland. I know I said earlier that I didn't like using horror heroes who just use guns because that's not that creative and there isn't a whole lot that you can do with them. But there's a difference between firing off a shot once or twice to take down the bad guy and turning your gunplay into a symphony of destruction the way that Tallahassee does. In fact, for this final hero, it came down to either him or Burt Gummert from Trimmers. But Tallahassee just does so much more with his weapons, and he uses a wide range of non-firepower tools as well. We could give him a special where he just starts beating the crap out of you with a banjo. There is no limit to how many crazy props we could have him pull out. Heck, we could even give him a super where he pulls out a Twinkie and eats it, and now he starts regenerating health for a limited amount of time. And besides, how can you deny Tallahassee the chance to be in this game? His whole business is killing monsters, and
Business is good.
you show Tallahassee the roster of this game, and it would be like letting a kid loose in a candy store. He would have a field day running through this arcade ladder. And remember those special rule graphics that pop up in Zombieland? How about to give Tallahassee some extra flair, you have him pop up on screen whenever he does his specials. You could even have his level 3 bring up the Zombie Kill of the Week award. However, in order to try and balance Tallahassee out, let's say that for all of his ranged attacks, he would only have a limited amount of ammo, and after you use it up, you would then have to take a moment to reload, which would leave him wide open for an attack. However, for his power-up, let's say that within a single round, you can bring up a certain number of those rule title cards, let's say about like 6 or 7 different ones in a single match. Then all of a sudden he would enter nut up or shut up mode, and now he would have unlimited ammo for the rest of the round. Next up, I want to include another recent character, and it was tough picking who would be in here, but over the past 2 years, there's one name I have heard horror fans bring up over and over. Megan. Yeah, I'll be totally honest with you, I thought Megan was just alright. It didn't really blow me away, but I have read reviews and I have seen audiences' reactions, and I know I don't speak for everyone else. This movie had a ton of fans, so it would be a big deal to include her. Plus, she was a doll who could tap into the internet and control machines, which is the exact same premise of that Chucky from the Child's Play reboot. So I gotta admit, I would love to see Chuck's pre-fight dialogue with her. Just have him walk up and say, "Whoever thought that having a doll with control over the internet would be a good idea? God, that guy should be fired." As for her power-up, seeing as how she is an incredibly advanced machine that continues to learn as she goes, let's say that we give her a download super, where for 1 bar she can download an upgrade that increases her speed, her strength, or her defense. But you get to decide which one goes up. So basically, as the match goes on, you get to customize her stats however you want. You want to turn yourself into a wall? Spend all your meter on defense. You want to be the craziest rushdown character you can think of? Spend all your meter on speed. And now we come to the penultimate character. And when you're this close to the end, you want a surprise. You want something that'll leave people shocked. And if Dead by Daylight has taught me anything, it's that
there's nothing more powerful than imagination.
Yeah, screw it. Why not? Why not include Nick Cage in here? Okay, in all seriousness, I'm not just going to put Nick Cage into this roster. Although, in full disclosure, I almost did. I actually, in the initial script for this episode, just put Nick Cage in here because, hey, he's in Dead by Daylight. There is a precedence for him going head-to-head with movie monsters. But no. Even though I do believe that the third season of DLC should be breaking the rules, that's breaking a lot of rules. So, no, we're not just going to put Nick Cage in here, but we are going to be including his character Red from Mandy. Who, real talk, most people don't even know that character's name, they just refer to him as Nick Cage, and I can't blame them. Mandy, for anyone who has never seen it, is a psychedelic, trippy, grindhouse 70s style revenge movie. It's a lot of things, but it is a horror film, and it is definitely an instant cult classic. It's about a man whose wife is murdered by a cult where everyone looks like they came out of a crossover between Twisted Metal and American Horror Story. And to get revenge, he goes down a deep, deep rabbit hole of things that I don't know if I can fully say here and still hope for this video to get monetized. The film is emotional, it is dark, but then it also has stuff like Cheddar Goblin in there, so it's kind of just a grab bag of anything you can think of. And I definitely think that Cage's character Red would be an amazing addition to this roster, not just because he has shown off that he knows how to fight, but because he is loaded with personality. I mean, his trademark weapon in that film is an axe that looks like if the paintings on the sides of everyone's 80s vans all merged into a single weapon. And you know what we don't have right now in this roster? A stance fighter. In this movie, Cage fights with his bare hands, a knife, that mythical axe that I just mentioned, and he even gets into a chainsaw duel. At this point, if I haven't convinced you to watch this film yet, I don't know what else I can possibly say. But let's say that Cage can swap between his fist, his axe, and the chainsaw, and the way that you power Cage up is he has got a... let's just call it a Cage meter for now. But if you land a combo that involves you switching between two different stances, then that Cage meter would slowly increase. And once that Cage meter is full, he would go into the biggest freakout you had ever seen, and now all of his heavy attacks would either pop you a little bit higher into the air, cause a wall bounce, or cause a ground bounce depending on which stance you're in. And each of those would lead into some very long combos with Nick Cage screaming the entire time. Also, we gotta give him a super where he summons in Lizzie the Tiger to pounce on you. And yes, I know that Lizzie the Tiger isn't even his tiger in the film, but I'm putting my foot down, this has to happen.
Bye, Lizzie.
And that brings us to the final character, and you have to go out on a big name, and on a big surprise. Someone that you might not expect, but they would still make sense, and they'd end the entire series on a bang. So our final DLC character is... Yeah, Beetlejuice isn't a horror movie, but it's a comedy that is drenched in horror themes, and you would be hard-pressed to find a horror fan out there who wouldn't be willing to accept the ghost with the most into their ranks. As for his playstyle, he would be all about just messing with the opponent. Countering and sliding around them, hitting them with some kind of a gross-out stun attack that leaves them open for follow-ups, and I've been pointing out this whole time that there's a running theme in this game where every character would have some kind of an ability that builds up over time? Well, since Beetlejuice is our final character, that means it's the best character to mess with that theme. Give him a taunt that would actually decrease the buff or power-up of the other character. If the opponent builds up some kind of a meter, this taunt lowers that meter. If the ability has to build up a certain number of stocks, it drops that stock down by 1. For more specific characters, it would get a little bit more personal. For the Xenomorph, it would delay how long the chest burster takes to come out. For the Wishmaster, it would return one of the wishes back to him. To balance this out, he would have to be one of the weaker characters when it comes to damage, but hey, that's fine with me. He always felt like he was more about playing with his prey than actually beating them up. But speaking of those power-ups, you know we have to give him some kind of mechanic where he can make somebody say, Beetlejuice. Maybe it's a super that costs 1 meter, or maybe it's a special move that can only be activated under very specific circumstances. Maybe if he does a combo of a certain number of hits, then the combo counter would come up and it would say it. But once you trigger this 3 times, lightning would strike, his theme would start playing, and he would shout out,
It's showtime!
and for the rest of the round, his super meter would just start building all on its own, letting his magical powers run rampant. He would be an incredibly fun addition to this game. And also very annoying, but that feels appropriate for his character. And an appropriate way for this game to go out. But there you have it, everyone, our roster and DLC for the ultimate horror movie fighting game. As I said, I've been wanting to do this one for a long time because I don't know if I've made it clear or not, I freaking love horror movies! Seriously, you have no idea how hard it was for me to not do a 4th and 5th season of DLC because I could totally do a 4th and 5th season. I've got 12 more contestants all written down with full movesets for each of them. And while this show is partly about figuring out what characters would be fun to put into a fighting game roster, the big appeal of Build a Roster to me has always been about figuring out how non-fighting game characters could be interpreted into a fighting game. How could their unique personalities and traits all be put into moves, and how could we spice them all up to translate what we love about them into this genre? And today, I got to do that with a topic I love, so I thank all of you for letting me just geek out for however long this video has been going on, and an especially big thanks to all of our patrons whose names are going up on the screen right now. If you want to join them and get stuff like access to our Discord, voting on upcoming projects, sneak peeks at videos, and more, then follow the link in the description down below. And hey, while you're down there, check out the links to all of our socials. You can find me on Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads, Twitters, all at Thorgy's Arcade. And you can also find us at twitch.tv/Thorgy's Arcade, where we've been streaming some spooky games all month long. Thanks for tuning in today, everyone. Let me know who you would want to see in a horror movie fighting game, or let me know if you're curious to check out any of the movies that I talked about today. If you've already seen some of these films, let me know your thoughts. Always love some good horror movie talk. Thanks again for tuning in, everyone. Stay safe out there, and happy Halloween.